before recording starts.
All right, so by continuing to be in this meeting, you're consenting to be recorded. So
You click on
I'm
continue.
pushing continue, and hopefully the other ones will too. But if you don't want to, then if anybody objects, we just won't record it. All right, Scott? If anybody doesn't want to, we just won't. But hopefully we will. I see on my screen that there are 9 of us here. I think Joe Oates said he might join, so that's great to have the 9 that we have. And we have 3 minutes to go, so take your time.
Derwin, are you there?
See his name there. And Mort's back with us.
So I was saying that my computer has been a little dodgy lately, so if I disappear, I will try to come back and I'll keep Gloria updated on what's happening.
Great. That's really great.
Hi, Mort.
Hello, everybody.
Hey, Mort.
Hi.
Good to
Mort.
see you. Good to see you.
Great.
Thanks for being here. Appreciate that.
I'm interested in it.
It's an interesting topic, so I hopefully will keep it interesting and not boring, but that's my job, I guess. We're going to start in a few seconds, so just hang in there. Sherwin said he's having trouble with the microphone, so as long as you can hear, I guess that's all right. I would, I appreciate people participating if they can, and I'm going to make a few announcements. All right, 2 o'clock has come. Shalom to all, and we welcome you to Beit Chaverim, our adult education class, an overview of Judaism and the Jewish people over a period of 12 weeks, not all consecutive, but we're on the 4th week today. I'm Rabbi Jim Mirel, I think you know, and we are planning to record this as someone requested, not me, but so if anybody objects, let us know now. When you speak, when it's being recorded, I don't think your name won't be appearing on the recording, just mine. Anyhow, today we have a very important topic, but it's a challenging one. And I have to say that in my 50 years of teaching, I've never really had an opportunity to do one extended class on this topic, which is the Talmud. So I gave it a lot of thought, and my goal is to really take the high level view of what the Talmud is, starting from square one. Although I know that there are people on the call who are regular students of the Talmud and study it virtually every day. So we have a broad range of people, but even the people who study it every day may never have really given thought, as even I hadn't until I prepared for this class, exactly what we mean and how to teach what the Talmud is. So that's my job, and I have a kind of a 20 questions overview of the Talmud that I'm going to try to do to give you that idea. But I want to really encourage you throughout the course of these 90 minutes or 88 minutes left to really participate by asking probing questions. There's Joe, thank you. Probing questions, because I don't want to make assumptions at what you know or what I know. I really want it to be really clear. And at the end of the 90 minutes, I hope that I will have a better understanding of really what we mean by the Talmud, which is, I say, a complicated idea. So I want to begin with just a little bit of the historical background, of how this collection of writings came about, because the Talmud is a collection of writings. Just like we spoke about the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, we spoke about that. I gave an overview of it. That is a collection of writings over many centuries. And in a similar way, the Talmud is a collection of writings that was written over many centuries. But I think it's fair to say that the Talmud begins approximately when the Tanakh comes to an end. There could be a slight overlap, but the people who wrote the Tanakh over a period of over 1,000 years, they lived, as you'll next week, if you go study history with Michael Banks, you'll understand they lived in different places and different times. And the same can be said by the people who wrote the Talmud. And they wrote it for similar reasons, to explain what is the meaning of life, what is the meaning of Judaism. They had the same basic approach, but they had a particular view of the world that was a different view of the world than, I would say, the writers of the Tanakh. They had a different context. So when was the Talmud written? I'm going to say approximately going back over a period of about 700 years. The Tanakh was probably about 1,000-year period when it was written. This is a 700-year period, the long period of time. And a lot of things happened during that time. It's approximately, I'm going to say, from 150 BCE to around 650 CE. So that's even more like 800 years. It's an 800-year period, a long period. And it was written by different people, obviously, over 800 years, but they had a similar view of the world. So there's kind of a unifying quality to the Talmud that maybe is not even found in the Tanakh. There's more of a unity. And I think it could be fair to say that the Talmud was edited in a way that was really different than the Tanakh was edited. It was edited in a unitary way. All right, so who were the people who wrote it and where were they living? Well, they were written by Jews. First of all, it's a Jewish book or Jewish collection. It was written all by Jews. And there was a particular group of Jews. And we call that particular group of Jews by the collective name, the Rabbis. The Rabbis were a class of people living in the Jewish society of that time. They were the scholars. They were the keepers of the tradition. They may have really invented the tradition. And when we talk about this period, we talk about the rabbinic rabbi period in Jewish life. And they collectively were known as the rabbis. They weren't everybody. It was not everybody. It was a somewhat elite group of people who spent their life studying together, learning together, and they were trying to come up with, I'm going to say, the one overarching role of the rabbis, at least during most of this period, was this one thing. How do we live as Jews in a meaningful way now that the temple no longer stands in Jerusalem? Because in the year 70, approximately, CE, even though there were rabbis teaching before then, clearly, but from that point on, the Talmud focus was living an everyday Jewish life without the temple. Now, having said that, they spent a lot of time talking about the temple, a lot of time talking even about the sacrifices of the temple, because their view was that ultimately or eventually the temple would be rebuilt and people should know how to perform the rituals. But really, if you think about it and you read it, it's really how to live your life day to day life of living a Jewish life. So in that respect, they're very similar to who we are. Very similar to who we are. We're asking the same questions they're asking. How do we live our life day to day in a meaningful way, in a Jewish way?
Hi, Judy.
They were living in a Jewish way. So that's my overview of what the Talmud was all about.
Yeah,
Not
it's
telling you
the-
what
it's
it
the
is, but
same
what
link
was
as
about.
always.
All right. Now I'm hearing somebody talk in the back.
Sorry.
I hear somebody talking, maybe a phone
tinyquara.com
call. Somebody on the phone.
/ Beit Chaverim class
Oh,
3.
sorry. All right. So
Yes.
I see Gloria Earlhurst. Welcome you and Joseph. That welcome to you. And I
Are
think we've
you
got a
in?
full complement of people.
Okay, you might need a password, so I'm looking up the password.
384461. 384461. Whoever's trying to get on.
384. The password is 384461.
All right. Yeah, I'm smart. I have it right in front of me. Now, all right. I haven't really told you what the Talmud is, but I told you about the people who were writing the Talmud. And they had a particular view of the life of Judaism. So what is the Talmud? What is the Talmud? And I'm going to say it is 2 collections of Jewish writings written during this long period of time, 2 different collections, both known somewhat confusingly as the Talmud. On a similar way, why 2 Talmuds? Why are there 2 Talmuds? That's a big question, because we say, what is a Talmud? They're going to say, there are 2 Talmuds. Well, at that time, and it's very similar to our moment in history right now, there were 2 main Jewish communities. 2 main Jewish communities living not too close to each other, fairly far away from each other. Hi, Peter. So where were they? One was in Eretz Yisrael, living in the land of Israel. And we have to talk about those people. Very important. But at the same time, and parallel to them, and maybe somewhat in correspondence with them, was a large Jewish community, I think larger, during most of this time, living in what we call the Eastern Middle East, what we call Iraq and Iran, but they would call Babylonia. Babylonia, that was a historical name. And they were living in the cities of Babylonia. So let's just put it right on the second part. 2 Talmuds, both on the same topic, same ideas, slightly different philosophy. One was known as the Talmud of the land of Israel, and the second one was known as the Talmud of Babylonia. And in Hebrew, we call that the Bavli, Babylonian Talmud, and the other one is called the Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, although it was not written in Jerusalem, it was written in the Galilee. All right, now, when we speak about the Talmud today, invariably, we're talking about the Babylonian Talmud. That has become the standard text of the Talmud. And when people study the Talmud, whether in Seattle or in Jerusalem or Paris, they're invariably studying the Babylonian Talmud. So the letter B, it says Talmud B, and that means the Babylonian Talmud. So if you see a reference to the letter B, Babylonian Talmud. Now, just like the Tanakh, there are different books of the Talmud. Different books of the Talmud, but they were written really by the same people. So it's not like the Tanakh with different authors. They were written by the same people, so it's more of a collection than an anthology. So that's the name of the game. And the stories, and I'm going to tell you some of the stories from the Talmud. I might tell some from the Jerusalem Talmud too, but mostly from the Babylonian Talmud. Now, there's one other thing about the Talmud that makes it really interesting. There are two very distinct levels in the Talmud. Not two Talmud collections, which I already talked about, but two levels, early and late, early and late. And this might be a little technical, but it's really important. The early collection of the Talmud was known as a separate, the initial creation of the early rabbis was known as the Mishnah. And then the later collection is known as the Gomorrah. Collectively, they're known as the Talmud. How does the Talmud work? The way it works is this. This Mishnah, which we'll talk about later, there's a section from the Mishnah. It's right in the text, a small section of the Mishnah, and then there's a commentary on that, the Gomorrah, and that's how the Talmud works. Mishnah, Gomorrah, Mishnah, Gomorrah. It tells you what the Mishnah says and what says, and then the Gomorrah goes on. Now,
Rabbi, can I ask a question?
Please do. I want a lot of questions.
So if you're reading the Daf Yomi, if you're reading the page a day,
yeah.
Which part of that are you reading? Are you reading Mishnah? Are you reading Gomorrah? Are you reading both?
Reading both, because it's right one F. It's ways printed. There's a section of the Mishnah with the letter Mem, and then a section of the Gomorrah with the letter Gimel. So when someone's teaching the Daf Yomi, they're usually going to tell it, which Daf Yomi means a daily study of the Talmud. I'll talk to you about it in a few minutes, all of you, because it's something that you can do. A good teacher will teach you, say, now the Mishnah, I'm reading the Mishnah now. Now this is what the Gomorrah says. And it's a little bit of Mishnah and then a long passage of Gomorrah usually, then a little bit of Mishnah and a long passage of Gomorrah. So when you're reading it, when you see it on the page, whether it's translation or in the original, you'll definitely be able to tell when the Mishnah is and when the Gomorrah is, because it's very clearly delineated. And
Thank you.
Make a distinction because there are different times, same topics basically. Now here's something really interesting, and I want more questions. Both the Jerusalem and the Babylonian Talmud have the same basic format. The Mishnah, which was written exclusively in the land of Israel, by the way, and before the year 200 CE, by the way, for whatever reason, and it's an interesting reason, that was written in exclusively, I would say, almost exclusively in Hebrew letters. The Gomorrah almost exclusively is written in a different language with Hebrew letters called Aramaic. And the question is, why did the rabbis choose to write the Gomorrah, which you might say is a commentary on the Mishnah, the Talmud, the rest of the Talmud? Why did they write it in Aramaic? And believe me, while I can say that very, simply, it's a very, very complex and interesting question that I don't think scholars have really been able to really say why it was that it was going to be written in Aramaic. And we can speculate. Was Aramaic the vernacular language that they spoke every day? Perhaps. Or was it the special language of study? Perhaps. Was it seen as just a variation of Hebrew because there are a lot of similarities, same roots and everything? Did they just think of it as Hebrew? I don't think so. They probably knew it was a different language, but sometimes it kind of went back and forth. So because Aramaic is a different language, and because Aramaic is not spoken today virtually, I would say, I'm going to say 100%, but 99.999% not spoken today by any ethnic group in the world. one time it was a very popular language. Anybody who studies the Talmud today has to learn this language, this different language, a language that nobody speaks vernacularly. So if you go to Israel, the students of studying Talmud in Israel have the same problem that we have studying Talmud in America. We're learning it in a language that we don't speak. So speaking Hebrew won't help you very much with Aramaic. Speaking English won't help you at all. So you have to have a totally different language and a language set. And Jews from the Talmudic period on, the Rabbinic period on, even into the Middle Ages, the students, the scholars, knew that language very well. Didn't speak it, but they could read it and still can, because that's what the Talmud is written in. Now, what do we know about Aramaic? Well, we know, the only thing we know about Aramaic, from a popular point of view, is that a few of the prayers in our Jewish prayer book, a few of our prayers are written in at least a form of Aramaic. And the most famous, there are two famous prayers that are written in Aramaic. I can say, all right, this is a quiz. Not exactly a quiz, but I can see some of your hands. I can't see Joe's hand, Michael, Gloria, Scott, the Sherman, but I can see everybody else's hand. Anybody want to raise your hand and say, what are the two prayers that are written in Aramaic?
Isn't part of the Kiddush? Is the Kiddush is written in Aramaic?
The Kaddish.
Kaddish, I meant.
The Mornis Kaddish is mostly in Aramaic. And if you hear it, it does sound a little bit different than Hebrew. Yit gadal v'yit kadash shemei rabbah v'alma divrach hirute. It sounds kind of like Hebrew, but it sounds a little different. It's a different language. So why is the Kaddish written in Aramaic, not Hebrew? I can give you my theories. What's the other really famous prayer that's in Aramaic? And I'll give you a hint. It's only done once a year. Kol Nidre. I think Tim said that. The Kol Nidre, the prayer that we say on Yom Kippur evening. Now, I have to say that that's not exactly a prayer. It's a formula, but it's a formula that has become like a prayer, and it's become really one of the most famous prayers in Jewish life, because everyone goes to synagogue on Yom Kippur evening and hears a Kol Nidre, but that's all in Aramaic too. We talk about why it is, the rabbis kept most of the prayers in Hebrew. We can talk about that, thank God, because it's easy to pray in Hebrew. But a few of them were in Aramaic. So Aramaic, the language, and it was a vernacular language of that time and that place. We're not exactly sure when Jews started speaking Aramaic as a vernacular, or how many really did. Probably they did. And sometimes we learn things from Christian literature, and this is one thing we probably do learn from Christian literature. When the New Testament quotes from the vernacular, not in Greek, but from vernacular, they often quote in Aramaic. So it shows kind of like that was probably the vernacular of many Jews of that time. But it became the language of study. So it's written in Aramaic. So the third question I'm going to ask you, what is the main focus? What's the main focus of the Talmud? I gave you kind of an overview of how to live a Jewish life. How to live a Jewish life. But what are the main things that they thought were central to living a Jewish life? What were the main elements of a Jewish life according to these teachers and rabbis? And what was their focal point? And I will say there was one thing that was overriding for them. And we can just speculate why it was. The most important thing was to study. Study was the main focus of their life. Everything else was secondary. Studying Torah, and we have so many stories I don't have time to tell you, but where even during the most extreme times of crisis, whether there would be personal crisis or communal crisis, the rabbis would say, keep studying Torah. That's what you're here for. That's even if you're under the threat, the penalty of death, keep studying Torah. That to me, and why were they saying that? Well, that was their view of the world. And of course, when they say study Torah, they mean studying the actual Torah, but also studying their view of the Torah, the Talmud itself. And later on, Talmud became the main source of study. But studying was the number one thing. And by the way, I would say this is a footnote, but not irrelevant. Why are there so many, quote unquote, Jewish Nobel Prize winners, et cetera, and a lot of people have theories about that. I would say one of the reasons is probably because both culturally and maybe even somewhat genetically, Jews were students. Jews were students, and science study just in our DNA. I'd say it's in our DNA, in our cultural DNA. We like to study things. We like to explore things and use logic and argument. And an argument also is part of study, going back and forth. And that's how science is done. One scientist says one thing, another one says another. There's an experiment. You go back and forth. And that's the nature of this Talmud. Yes, the Talmud is also a repository of what went on in the study house. Because the good part of the Talmud is actually a recording, almost like recording the minutes of a meeting. Who said what, where, and when in the study house? This person said Y, this person said X, this person said Z, and maybe some editor comes along, and we follow Z, or we follow Y. So another thing that we find in the Talmud, another focus is, what are the laws of Jewish life? You might say, well, isn't that what the Torah is all about, the 5 books of Moses? A lot of laws there, but how do you live out those laws, particularly if you're living in Babylonia or in Eretz Israel in a different time when the temple is not standing? So how to pray, how to eat, how to engage in marital relationships, how to live your life, and then I would say the ethical parts, how to treat each other, that view of life. How do you get along with each other? That is it. So I'm going to stop right there because we've got first 3 or 4 questions. And anybody else want to ask a question, or anybody want to make a comment? Comment or question? Yes, Tim.
I'm wondering, because Aramaic was the lingua franca was probably not the best term to use,
Yeah.
but because it was as you say, the common speech for Jews in many different countries, and most Jews at this point lived outside of Israel, whether the use of Aramaic may not have been intended to make the Talmud, or at least the Gomorrah, accessible to more people and to more students and teachers especially in more places. Because being the vernacular, it was easier for them to understand, and reaching into everyday life, it was important that more people be able to understand it.
Yeah, I think, it's a very good point you're making. I don't think that they wrote the Talmud in Aramaic to make it obscure. That would be one theory, and I can't say the theory, maybe for us it sounds, well, if they want to really make this thing obscure, write in Aramaic. But I think it's the other way around. It was like writing in English for Americans. Most, in America, most Jewish books are written in English. And 2,000 years from now, they say, why did they write so many things in English? Were they trying to keep it obscure so no one could understand it? No, people could understand it. So that's probably the theory that I have, that it was probably the language of the everyday. But other scholars say maybe not. Maybe it was just the language of the rabbis in Babylonia, and the other people didn't have it. I think it was maybe more the first and the latter, but it's a really good question. And today, it's an interesting process. By the way, go ahead, Donna.
I'm trying to understand the the Talmud is made up of two collections, the Mishnah and the Gomorrah.
Yes.
You said the Mishnah is written in Hebrew and
Yes.
the Gomorrah is written in Aramaic.
Aramaic.
So
Aramaic. Yeah.
Is the Gomorrah, from what I'm gathering, you're saying kind of an interpretation in this other language of what the Mishnah says in Hebrew?
Yeah.
You said that they're trying to interpret the Mishnah.
Yes.
So is that what they're doing, like a critical
Exactly.
analysis in the common language of the time, right?
Yeah, and they're trying to expand upon the Mishnah. Yes, if you were to say what the Talmud is, both the Mishnah and the Gomorrah is a commentary on the Mishnah. And you could even say the Mishnah in some ways is a commentary on the Torah, but I wouldn't say that's exactly true. But it's a process. Historically, Torah first, then Mishnah, then Gomorrah, in terms of the chronology. But I also think that Gomorrah is definitely a commentary on the Mishnah, but they go far afield sometimes. They start with the Mishnah, and they go quite far afield. And the question really is how to live your life. How do you live your life? And another big part of the Gomorrah, of the Talmud in general, is really, well, what's a big part of life? Well, marital relationships, yes, but eating, what you can eat. Now, you might say, well, the Torah is pretty clear about what you can eat and what you can't eat, but you'd be surprised how many variations on that theme comes along, and how to prepare food. And particularly when it comes to the Shabbat, how to prepare food on the Shabbat, what you can do in Shabbat, what you can't do in Shabbat. And it often has to do with things like cooking and keeping food warm, things that are very, very practical things that have to do with Shabbat. And then, of course, the other part was holidays, how to observe the holidays. Shabbat, we call them tractates, that's just a Latin word, but we call Masechot, the different books of the Talmud. There were books, there's 63 of them, but I'll have to give you a little footnote on that. 63 is a lot. But one of the biggest books of the Talmud, or tractates, is Shabbat. Well, Shabbat's a big one, because Shabbat is 1/7 of your life, but it has the most complicated rules. But there's also a tractate about how to celebrate Yom Kippur, called Yoma, Aramaic. How to celebrate Rosh Hashanah, how to celebrate Purim, Megillah, etc. So those things are important too. Everyday life, special times, marriage and divorce and marital relationships are also a very big part of that. Several different tractates about marital life. So the things that we are concerned about every day. And then there is one very famous book of the Mishnah, which we'll talk about later if we have time. I hope we will. And I might send it to all of you in a few minutes. If you don't have a copy, it doesn't matter because we're not going to read it. The most interesting part of the Mishnah, in my view, and the only book of the Mishnah that's printed in most prayer books. One book of the Mishnah is printed in most prayer books, and that's called Avot, or Pirkei Avot. Pirkei Avot is just a collection of sayings written in the Mishnah, not the Gemara, just the Mishnah, and it tells you the basic values and ethics and moral of life, how to be a good person, how to be a good person. And how to be a good person is obviously in Judaism, how to treat your neighbor, how to get along with your neighbor and your friends and your relatives, also how to respect God. I guess I should say one thing about Pirkei Avot, which we'll read a little bit about. The reason why the generations have printed the Pirkei Avot in the prayer book, because it was so beloved, because it was so accessible. First of all, it was in Hebrew, it's written in Hebrew, fairly simple Hebrew, and it's short. It's like little pithy sayings, that's called the sayings of the fathers, and they really tell you how to live your life. So, for example, what is one passage or from the Pirkei Avot that's well known. It's one that was attributed to Hillel, one of the great teachers of the 2nd century BCE, in the 100s of BCE. And what did he say? Im ein al nili mili, v'ani latzmi mani, v'im lo achshav eimatai. What did he say? 3 things. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? But if I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? You've heard that. And so many people outside the context of Judaism have said that, particularly that last expression, if not now, when? That was a civil rights movement. That's anything that's current. If not now, when? V'im lo achshav eimatai. And that's, that was one of the passages in the Mishnah of the Avot. So these why are so important. Earl.
Yeah, Jim, you said something that really got me thinking, and it was about how Talmud teaches about marriage and divorce. And of course, when I think about marriage, I think about arranged marriage, but maybe that wasn't part of the Talmud because that may be more modern of everything that we've learned coming from the old country, watching movies, Fiddler on the Roof. What does, in very broad strokes, marriage and divorce in the Talmud, what does it say?
Well, I would say in that one respect, the Talmud, as I say, in the Mishnah, collectively, the Mishnah Gomorrah, does take off from the Torah. And the Torah had a view of marriage, and it was pretty straightforward, but it always included the possibility of divorce. So it's right there in the Torah. So it's just expanding upon the Torah. But the question that you ask is a very good one. Was it customary in the Talmudic times, 800-year period of time, in the land of Israel and in Babylonia, for marriages to be arranged by a matchmaker? And that's a really good question. Now, that would be a very technical question that you'd have to go and read the tractates that having to do with marriage. And I would say, from my reading of it, I'm not going to say I'm an expert because I'm not an expert on the 63 books of the Talmud. Arranged marriages were not really, didn't seem to be the necessary the way that things went. I think that the view of, both in the Torah, there are sometimes arranged marriages, but romantic love is still kind of the ideal, I would say, in large part in the Tanakh, in the Bible. I think that romantic love matches are also kind of the common way of looking at marriage in the Talmud. The arranged marriage, that might have been a later affectation, perhaps. Divorce, again, there's a whole book in the Talmud about divorce. So divorce is available in a complex way, never done in a light way. And they always said that that God weeps when someone goes through a divorce. So he said that even though it's legally possible, it's something that was, say, will be a last resort. But if it was done, the one great thing about the Talmud, while in the Bible, in the Torah, there certainly was an idea that someone should be respected, the woman should be respected, both in marriage and in the case of divorce. But the Talmud does something really special, and you know this from your daughter's wedding and maybe from your own as well. There's a ketubah, there's a marriage document, and that's the rabbis of the Talmud was very explicit. What is that ketubah all about? It has to do mainly with making sure that if a woman is divorced, and it was something that was initiated by a man technically, but the woman would get a very clear and sustaining settlement. We call it alimony, but that didn't call it alimony, but they got the terms of the get, and that was a financial settlement that would be very generous, so that it couldn't be woman just set aside No, there was definitely a penalty. You know, it was so very important. Now, I don't want to get into the specifics. The Talmud and the Bible, to a great extent, talks basically about monogamous marriage. Now, it's true that some of the early patriarchs did have more than one wife and they had concubines. But if you read the rest of the Bible, it's basically trying to say caution against having polygamous marriage. And I think the Talmud is similar. The Talmud really has a strong emphasis on a monogamous marriage. Even though technically it was still available, polygamy, but it was not the common rule. It was not the common rule. So I'm getting a little bit on the sidetrack, but it's a really good question because a lot of the Talmud has to do with marriage documents, marriage, divorce, and other issues having to do with complex things like what happens if a woman husband is lost at sea, common in those days, and the person is no witness to his death. Can she get remarried or not? How to go about that? Aguna, the yabum for the brother-in-law, etc. Now, all right. Now I want to get a little bit into some of the Talmud. One of the parts of the Talmud that is so intriguing to me, at least, is the stories of the rabbis themselves. What percentage of the Talmud is the stories of the rabbis? I mean, I'm not talking about simply the recording of what they said in the academy and their arguments back and forth, but actually the anecdotal stories about the rabbis and how they lived their lives. And they were not always exemplary people. Some of them were more exemplary than others, but they wrote it down anyhow. Just like in the Tanakh, King David had many good qualities, but you can always say that he was not a perfect person. Same thing with Yaakov, with Jacob and Joseph. They had their faults. Well, I would say that the one person that stands out in the Talmud, and he's talked about in the Talmud, and he was one of the people who lived in Talmudic times in the land of Israel, was a man by the name of Akiva, Rabbi Akiva. Now, I think that this guy is a really interesting guy. And according to most people, the rabbis themselves, he was the exemplar of the great master of Jewish law and Jewish wisdom. And he said, there are many things that said about him. And here's a kind of ideal of how Rabbi Akiva lived his life. Now, Rabbi Akiva, according to the Talmud, started off not as a rabbi. He started off as a poor shepherd without much knowledge of the Torah. So that's another kind of way of Akiva's being lifted up as an example. He wasn't somebody who was raised in the academy. He didn't go to school as a kid. He didn't go to the yeshiva. He didn't study. But later on in life, he took up the study of Torah with the help of his wife, by the way. His wife encouraged him at the age of 40. This would be something that you should do. And maybe it was even a story was in order to gain her hand, her father did have to give permission. The father of his wife said, I only want you to marry a scholar. So he went off for many years to study in order to be worthy of his wife. But then he became the leading scholar of his day, Rabbi Akiva. And there are many stories. Now, I'll tell you one thing about the end of his life. He lived during the time of Roman times. And a lot of the early Talmud, the Mishnah and the Talmud, has to do with life under the Roman times. The Romans were the ones who destroyed the temple. The Romans were oppressive people. And then after the temple was destroyed, a few decades later, there was another rebellion under Bar Kokhba, And during that time, many of the rabbis who continued to study Torah against the law were put to death, and they became the great martyrs, and Rabbi Akiva was among them. So under the Bar Kokhba rebellion, he died a very painful death at the hands of the Romans. Now I remind you that these were the Romans like the Julius Caesar Romans, the Tiberian Romans, the not Christians. These were when Rome was a pagan empire, not a Christian empire. So not Christian oppression. This is Roman oppression. But that's a footnote. It said it was related of Rabbi Akiva that he never said it is time to go home from the house of study, except on 2 occasions during the year, and you can guess what they were. In other words, I'm looking at some people here who are these, who I admire a great deal, who are the scientists, like the modern day Rabbi Akiva, and the ones who, are in their laboratories day and night. They go early and they go home late, and they're always working in the laboratories because they have a goal to how to conquer a disease or something, or how to make a vaccine, or how to conquer cancer. And those scholars, scientists, they are people who don't go home early because they have a dedication to their chosen calling. And that was Rabbi Akiva. He didn't go home from the house of study, never said, let's go home, it's time to quit. He would have been there all night, except for 2 occasions during the year, according to this passage from the Talmud. On the eve of Passover and on the eve of Yom Kippur. And it goes on to say, why did he allow the students to go home early on the evening of Passover? For the sake of the children, so that they would not fall asleep at the Seder. He didn't want to make sure the kids were up to enjoy the Seder, which is, that shows kind of a lighter side of him. Even on Passover, when it got to be getting towards evening, time to go home because you have to have the Seder, because the kids have to be at the Seder. And the kids have to enjoy the Seder and be asked the 4 questions. By the way, the 4 questions that we say at the Seder are from the Talmud. Not in the Bible, but they're from the Talmud. And there was the other time. Well, remember, he's telling his students are there. He has hundreds of students. The other night that he said you can go home early is Yom Kippur, Erev Yom Kippur. Well, and the reason they say in the Talmud, so that his students could go home and make sure that their kids were fed before the fast began. So again, it was both when he did give permission to go home early, those 2 nights a year. Obviously, it's a little bit not literal because obviously they would go home for Shabbat, but he wanted to study as long as he possibly could. But on those 2 occasions, for the sake of the kids, you can go home early. So you let everybody out at 5 o'clock instead of at 7 o'clock. Go home, make sure the Seder starts early enough, or start it as early as you can so the kids can stay up and enjoy the Seder, because it's for the kids. He said it's for the kids. If they're sleeping, they're not going to enjoy it, and we're missing the point of the Seder. The Seder is to teach the kids. And then, of course, Yom Kippur, you're going to fast by a certain time. Well, you better have food for the kids. Not for yourself, but for the kids. All right. Now, Earl kind of mentions a little bit, and I want to talk about this for a second, a little bit. It is clearly that the Talmudic world, even more than in the world of the Bible, is a world that is very masculine-centered. It's a masculine world. The people studying in the house of study were all men. The people writing the Talmud were all men. Women were definitely considered second class in that respect, that they were not studying in the house of study. And, If you saw the movie Yentl, you know, pretty good story based on a story by Isaac Bashevis Singer, by the way. But, you know, this young woman in Eastern Europe wanted so much to be part of that world, which was such a exalted part of the world, that she pretended to be a man and to study in the yeshiva. And that, you know, one of his best stories, and quite a good movie, musical as well. But that doesn't occur in one or two places, actually, in the Talmud. There are similar stories where women pretend to be men in order to study, but secondary. Mostly the women are not there. But the question is, and Earl mentioned this, what was the attitude of the Talmudic rabbis, the rabbis who were writing the Talmud, about women? And you can see that it was a very mixed approach. Sometimes women were considered to be flighty and unreliable, and several places says you should not speak very much to women. And they're also concerned about the separation of sexes, and for a variety of reasons. But there are many places when women are very highly exalted and given a high position in the society, and the respect for women is very high. And you have to say, throughout the Talmud, you have different points of view about women. And there is a whole section of the Mishnah dedicated to women. By the way, I should have said that while mostly we read the Mishnah in the context of studying Talmud as part of the Talmud, you can read the Mishnah itself. There are editions that are just the Mishnah without the Talmud, and you know there's some value to doing those as well. But you have to say that you have the third section of the Mishnah, of 6. There are 6 sections of the Mishnah. The third section is dedicated to the study of women. Now, I say not always in the most positive way, but women have special rules, special limitations, and special privileges. So the laws of the sister-in-law of someone who has died, the marriage contract, ketubah, the nidarim, the vows, the nazir is under the women, sota, a whole tractate involving adultery, and then gitin, the bills of divorce, and finally kedushin, the act of betrothal and marriage. And again, that's part of that world. And we as Reform modern Jews who say, well, we believe in equality of women, and we do. And we're working on it every single day to make sure that that is who we are. And when we have women participate fully in the services, in the leadership of our congregations as rabbis, Tim's daughter's a rabbi, as cantors, my daughter's a cantor, you know, and leaders of the congregation and of the movement, but we still have a long way to go. But that was not the way life was in the Talmudic times, in the rabbinic times. The rabbis were men, and they had the high respect for women, but definitely a different category. And women had certain mitzvot that they were responsible for, but one of the, maybe whether it's positive or negative, one of the rules of the Talmud that's very explicit is that the positive time-bound mitzvot are only applicable to men. Positive, the things that you must do. The negative ones are all apply to men and women alike. So women still have to keep kashrut. They can't eat food that is forbidden, but they don't have to, for example, pray at a particular time of day. And the rabbis maybe explain that, well, they have other things that they have to do which are just as important, or maybe even more important than what we're doing as scholars. They have to take care of the home, they have to maybe make a living, they have to raise the children. So they have three main mitzvot, but that's the way. Now, how about another thing that I want to talk about very briefly is what is the attitude towards the non-Jew? You have to remember they lived in a world that they were very much isolated from the non-Jewish world in many respects, but not in all respects. They lived separately, they studied separately, they married within the Jewish world, but yet the non-Jewish world was there. It was sometimes benign, sometimes it was not very benign, sometimes it was negative. In general, though, I would say the attitude towards the non-Jewish world was one of respect, maybe sometimes a little bit of fear, but trying to get along with the outside world as best they can, while maintaining their own identity. And that was important. Now, you find that also really in the Tanakh as well, that the Jews of the Tanakh were also living sometimes in a world where the non-Jew is very important. But in the world of the Talmud, the Talmudic world, with the exception of the great rebellions of the land of Israel against the Romans, it was a time when Jews were trying to get along well with the authorities and with the non-Jewish world, and to treat people with respect and try to be treated with respect. So you don't have a lot of negative attitude toward the non-Jewish world, except maybe in one area, and that is Judaism is a belief in one God and no idols. And if the non-Jewish world was a world where idols were common, which was in Rome, they would definitely look down upon that as not the way to be. But they also would say that even the person who's worshiping an idol, they would say, is trying to show respect towards divinity. Question, Sherwin, or who's that next to you? Oh, hi, Robin. Question?
We keep hearing the same thing repeated over again in all the areas that were studied.
Yeah.
Respect for others, respect for non-Jews. Then I go back to my question of a while ago, why is Israel so disrespectful of the Reform movement?
All right, now within our own people, now you're talking about a different thing. How internally, the internal relationship among Jews in the time of the rabbis and our modern time, do we get along well with each other? That's something I didn't talk about yet. That's another big topic. The divisions among ourselves. And I would say that there were divisions in those days as well. There was division within the rabbinic world, even in the scholars. There's many stories about people not getting along with each other, not respecting each other, and in a very negative way. So I don't think it's modern. It's not an artifact of modernity. We ourselves, as a people, as a religion, as a group, we don't always get along among ourselves. Now, modern day Israel, which we might study some other time at some length, is a complex world. And if you would say, which group in modern Israel among Jews has the most negative image? The most negative image in Israel among Jews. Now, I'm not talking about Palestinian Arabs or Bedouins or anybody like that. We can talk about that. The ultra-Orthodox Jews have the most negative image in the general population for a variety of reasons. So you say, well, they don't have respect for the Reform movement. For most people in Israel, the Reform movement, is either neutral or positive. Among some, it isn't. But the real negative one is the average Israeli towards the ultra-Orthodox Jews. So in that respect, I might disagree with you in that regard.
Oh, good.
Now, but in terms of who has control of certain elements of the governmental society, there's something to be said that the Orthodox establishment sometimes has control of certain elements of the governmental things. And that's a complex thing. But if you talk about the average Israeli, believe me, their attitude towards Reform Jews is a lot more positive than they have towards the ultra-Orthodox.
Okay.
And I'll tell you in a short way why that is. And remember, the ultra-Orthodox is a good percentage of the population. Could be 20% of the Jewish population. Why? Because they feel they are not pulling their weight in the society. They're not pulling their weight, and therefore they have a lot of negative attitudes. They don't go to the army. They don't pay their taxes. They don't work. And for those reasons, the average Israeli, the other 80%, have a pretty negative view of them. Now, you know, sometimes you say, well, what other groups have negative attitude? Well, you know, there was a time when Jews from the Middle East, Jews from Yemen or Iraq, well, they weren't well respected, or Jews from here, or Jews from there. There's certain stereotypes. But basically, one thing we would say, we can criticize our own people, but don't let anybody else criticize us. If they criticize us, that's anti-Semitism. We don't like each other, that's not anti-Semitism. We just don't like each other. So your point is well taken. Joe, do you have something to say? I see you're, I don't know. All right, now, I want to stop there. We talked about attitude toward Jews, non-Jews. I want to talk about two other Hebrew words that are very important in the context of the Talmud and the Talmudic world. The Talmudic world. And this is a complex concept, and it's really one that you have to think about in a certain way. The view you say, what, if you ask someone who studies the Talmud, what is it all about? They say, halacha. Halacha. Halacha is a Hebrew word, halacha, and it's found in the Talmud in various places, not that many, but it's implied. Halacha means Jewish law. What is the law? And even though it's not systematically talked about in the Talmud all the time, the underlying idea is that to be a Jew is to follow the halacha. And a lot of the Talmud is what is required, what is forbidden, and what is optional. What you must do, what you should do, and what you cannot do. Jewish law. Later on in history, in Jewish history, later on, there were attempts to write down these laws in a very systematic way. Well, that's not the Talmud. But within the Talmud, you can find all the laws. And I'll give you an idea of how this works. The way they would talk about this is they say, the halacha, Jewish law, is sometimes like a mountain suspended by a thread.
Ooh.
The mountain is halacha. The thread is a little bit of the connection to the Torah. The Torah says one thing, and from that little thread, there's a large, large body of law that expands upon the basic Torah law. So let me give you an example of how this works. In the Torah, as we said last time or a few times ago, there's one basic law found in the Ten Commandments that's a ritual law. Ritual law. Now, the law of ethical laws are also laws too, but I'm talking about ritual laws. One law. Zachor et Yom HaShabbat l'chadsheo. Remember the Sabbath day in order to keep it holy. And then it goes on to say, 6 days you shall work, but the seventh day is a day of rest. And virtually speaking, that is a little thread. It's a basic law in the Torah, but very little about how to make that law how to live that law. And the Talmud in the tractate Shabbat, but in many other places too, goes into much, much, much detail. This is halacha, Jewish law, how to keep the Shabbat, what you can do, what you can't do, what you can touch, what you can touch, how far you can walk, how far, what you can carry, what you cannot carry. And that is found in the Talmud in great extent. That's why sometimes it says, it's kind of like they say, oh, it's very, very didactic and very picayune. Well, it is, because it's a very practical question. How do you study? How do you live the life to keep the Torah and keep the law of the Shabbat? And there's thousands, not hundreds, thousands of laws about how to keep the Shabbat. That is known as halacha. And if you know the halacha, then you know how you keep the Shabbat. Now, for example, in today's Talmud study class, the question is, you have a lamp in your house. All right, can you move the lamp on Shabbat? Well,
No.
the question is, well, what kind of lamp is it? Is it a new lamp? Is it an old lamp? Is it, what purpose, what was the concept? What was the intention? So a little thing like that, well, you know, why would you even give a thought to it? But that's what the rabbi said. You've got to think about it. If you're going to keep the Shabbat, keep it, you have to keep it properly. So what do? There are thousands and thousands of laws of what you can do on Shabbat. And for example, go ahead, Donna.
My question is, weren't there some Jews that rebelled against people trying to tell them what to do and all the rules they had to follow, even back in those times? And if there were, what happened to these people?
All right. So you would think, and this is a really good question, you would say, all right, well, there was debate among the rabbis about these questions, but they usually came to a conclusion. And generally speaking, whatever conclusion they came to, that was the law. That was halacha. It wasn't necessarily systematic. But you asked me a very good question. What would happen if they didn't do it? Were there people who were rebellious about it? And you know something? The interesting thing is that the Talmud is a self-contained document, and they don't really talk very much about people who are not keeping the law. Now, do we assume that there weren't people who weren't keeping the law? I don't know. I can't say. We can't go back to those days. And it's only in the modern times, and we have even in the late Middle Ages and maybe in the Enlightenment period, where we really read stories and people's recollections and their autobiographies where people maybe were not keeping the law. And there may be punishments that could be handed out. They talked about punishments, but generally speaking, they don't talk a lot about that. So they just said, we're assuming that people do keep the law, and that's what they wanted. And I think that in general, people did keep the law. And I can tell you some stories that sometimes the people, the rabbis saw themselves as an elite group, but they also realized that there were a lot of people who did not study regularly like they did, and they were the average person. They didn't necessarily have a negative attitude to the average person, as long as they were compliant to some extent. They called that group the Amei Haaretz, the Am Haaretz. The Am Haaretz was just the average person, the laborer, the person who was laboring, making a living. Well, the rabbis also were laborers also, but these guys were laboring, to make a living. They were shoemakers, they were blacksmiths. They weren't necessarily scholars, but generally speaking, the people kept the laws once they knew what they were. And if they weren't, if they didn't know what the law was, they would ask the rabbi. So it's a really good question. Now, I talked last week about Reform Judaism, and that was where it was a concerted effort to reform Judaism to make it more acceptable to modernity. But that was something from the 19th century, not going back to the Talmudic times. But it's a really good question about what people did. Now, sometimes, however, the rabbis do record people who did deviate from the norm, and they were put into a place, a category known as Chaverim. They were excommunicated, which means to be not communicated with. And one of the famous rabbis, Elisha ben Abuya, who said, what was his rebellion? It wasn't against halakha necessarily, but he rebelled against the theology. And I haven't talked much about theology. If you didn't believe, you had not only believed that the halakha is binding, but you also had to believe that the halakha is from God. And that's a really important part of the rabbinic Talmudic view. What did they say? A very famous story in the Talmud. Very famous story in the Talmud about Moses. Moses was a giver of the law. He was a giver of the Torah. He might have been the one who wrote it down. God dictated it to him. And then he said, what's going on now? I'd like to see what's going on in the world. He's in the heavens, let's say. God said, I'll say what's going on. And he goes down to Eretz Yisrael in the time of Rabbi Akiva. And Rabbi Akiva is teaching halakha. He's teaching in the academy. This guy, Rabbi, is a great teacher. And he's expounding the meaning of every little thing in the Torah, and even all the little crowns of the letters. And he's going into this long explanation. And here's a funny part. And the rabbis had a good sense of humor, by the way. And Moshe said, I don't understand anything he's saying. His explanation is so far beyond me, and the detail is so far beyond anything I know about Torah, I feel inadequate. This guy is so smart, and he knows so much about Torah. I just feel like I feel, humbled before him. He said, God said, just wait for a minute. Wait for a minute, because we're going to learn something. So Rabbi Akiva is teaching about all of this. And one of the students says, Rabbi Akiva, how do you know all about this? He said, I received it from tradition that was given to Moses. I learned it from Moses. Even though Moses didn't understand anything he was saying, he attributed the wisdom to Moses. And then he said, Moses said, I'm comforted. He's giving me credit, even though I don't deserve it. It's a kind of funny moment in the Talmudic text. But the rabbis had a good sense of humor. They said, all right. And the rabbis had the view that the oral Torah, the halakha, was given to Moses on Mount Sinai. They called it the Torah Shabbal Peh. But the rabbis also could laugh a little bit. Maybe even Moses didn't understand it. Maybe, they're saying it was so complicated. But Rabbi Akiva said, I got this tradition. I learned this from Moses. And when Moses heard that, he said, all right, I've seen enough. I can go back to heaven now. I feel better. And that's a funny story. But that's a very famous story. Now, let me tell you another thing about that you find in the Talmud, which is really, really interesting. There's another category of literature had nothing to do with Jewish law that's found in the Talmud.
Midrash.
I want to make sure you don't miss this. It's called Midrash. Did anybody hear the word Midrash? All right, Midrash means to explanation. What is Midrash? Midrash is the story, the expansion, and the commentary on the biblical text. Nothing to do with law, but it expands on the biblical text and tells the stories of the biblical characters not found in the Torah, but became part of the larger knowledge and the lore of Judaism, found mostly in the Talmud, sometimes in other parallel writings of the same time, known as the Midrash. But the Midrash is found in the Talmud, and this is the story. For example, and this is probably one of the most famous of the Midrashim. in the Torah, for example, we meet Abraham really as an adult at the age of 80, when God says to Abraham, go forth from your native land to the land that I will show you. I talked about that last time, Lech Lecha. And the rabbi said, well, the Torah tells us nothing about the childhood of Abraham. It tells us about the childhood of Isaac. It tells us about the childhood of Jacob. It tells us about the childhood of Joseph. What about the childhood of Abraham? So they made up a whole series of stories about the childhood of Abraham. And what is the most famous story about the childhood of Abraham? And what did Abraham discover as a child that made him special and worthy of being called? And if you can raise your hand if you want to say what you know about that early stories about Abraham. There's several, but some really famous stories about Abraham. We don't know anything about Abraham as a child in the Torah. Nothing, except he was born. A guy named Terach. That's the only thing we know. He was born.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
I remember the story, and I think that's what you're referring to as the story when Terach was an idol. He was an idol worshiper and an idol maker.
He was a maker of idols. According to the rabbis, his father was a maker of idols. And what happened then, Joseph?
Okay, so one day the father left Abraham in charge of taking care of the shop while he had to leave and go someplace. And when he got back, all the statues were on the ground. They were broken, and except for one. There was one God. There was one statue that was still standing. And when Abraham's father, I asked him, what happened, and he told him, he said that the gods got into a fight, and all of them killed each other and broke each other apart.
Right.
All that. So, to show that they were only stone. How could they do anything like that? So.
It was again a good sense of humor by the rabbis. Abraham teaches his father about the idea of one God by pretending that the idols were getting into a fight, and his father said, "Well, that can't happen." He said, "Well, if they can't fight each other and they can't do that, why are you worshiping them? If they can't move, you better worship. There's only one God." So what the rabbis are teaching in a funny way is that Abraham realized that the idols were not God and the sun wasn't God. There was one God of the universe, and that was his great contribution. All right, I'm going to go ahead, Don, and then Tim ask a question.
Okay.
Go ahead, Don.
Is the Midrash found in the Mishnah or is it in the Gomorrah?
I would say mostly in the Gomorrah, but it's mostly in the Gomorrah. And sometimes there are separate collections known as Midrashim of the same generation, the same rabbis. Sometimes those stories were collected in separate collections, but the stories of the one that you told, Joseph, is found in the Gomorrah. And many that are like that, telling the stories of Moses that are not in the Torah and Abraham, etc. And they're important stories, and because they became so much part of the lore of Judaism, if you ask maybe an average kid, even today, but in those days or in Middle Ages, well, is that story in the Torah? They would say, yeah, it's in the Torah, but it's not actually in the Torah. It's part of the Midrash. So it's a good question. Tim was asking a question about a later movement in Judaism. There was a later movement in Judaism a few centuries later, known as the Karaites, or Karaim. There were people who said, the Talmud's great. It was great, but it's not really part of our original document. So they said, we're going to follow the Torah, but we're not going to keep the Talmud. That was a very small break-off group, but for a long time, there were significant minorities. So getting back to Robin's question, I think it was, or Donna's, maybe those were people who didn't keep all the laws. And of course, that the Ethiopian Jews didn't have the Talmud either. So, but for the mainstream Judaism, whether Ashkenazic or Mizrahi or Ashkenazic, the Talmud was considered to be the authentic repository of Jewish law. Now, I'll ask you one or two other questions because we're getting towards the end. What about Christianity and Islam? Why are they not mentioned in the Talmud? why are Christianity and Islam virtually absent from the Talmud? And the answer is, for Islam, it's very simple. Islam arose just as the Talmud was being complete. So Islam didn't exist in the Talmudic period. So the Talmud doesn't speak about Islam because it came a few decades later after the Talmud was completed in Babylonia. But the Talmud reflects a pre-Islamic world where there were other religions in Babylonia, not Christianity mostly, and Christianity didn't exist too much even in the Jerusalem Talmud, because Christianity didn't become the main religion of the Western world, of the Roman Empire, which is including the Byzantine Empire, until the 4th century. So Christianity doesn't figure prominently in the language of the Talmud. Occasionally they might have a reference to early Christian leaders in a negative way, but not very much. So it exists in the Talmud, like the Bible obviously, doesn't take into account these other religions. It does take into account paganism. It might take into account a little bit of Zoroastrianism, but not Islam and Christianity. Now, on the other hand, I do want to say as a footnote, Christianity, the early doctrines of Christianity do have a little bit of that element of the Talmudic world built into their stories, because the rabbis were existing in the time of early Christianity. So, for example, some of the Jewish customs are mentioned in the New Testament for sure, not in a negative way, mostly in a positive way. But the word rabbi itself, Rabbi or Rav, is found in the New Testament, and not sometimes in a negative way, mostly in a positive way. So early on, the idea of the rabbi as the main authority in Judaism as a term came about probably in the first century CE. The early teachers in the Mishnah weren't given the title of rabbi. So it's just a title. Now, it's unfortunate that one place in the New Testament has I would say, not a mistranslation, but an interesting term. It's found in the New Testament, rabbi, the Hebrew or Aramaic word rabbi means teacher. It says rabbi means teacher in one of the Gospels, and I don't have that in front of me. And rabbi doesn't really mean teacher. You hear that often, rabbi means teacher. Well, rabbi doesn't mean teacher. Rabbi means literally the master of the literature, the master of the scholarly master, the headmaster. That's what it really means. When I say, what does the Rabbi mean, or Rabban? The headmaster. Just like we have a headmaster or the principal of a school, the word principal is closer to rabbi, the master. It doesn't necessarily mean teacher. There are other words for teachers, but that's a kind of a footnote. It's interesting that I'll just give one other thing about Christianity. It says, don't call any Christianity, the verse in the book of Mark, I think, don't call anybody rabbi, but it also says, don't call anybody father. Don't call anybody father. Well, the Christianity is called their priest father, and they call their biological father's father. So they don't follow that law, but it's something that Jesus said in a certain context. All right. Now, I'm going to get down.
Rabbi,
Yeah.
I'm confused about one thing. You said that the Talmud was written from 150 BCE to 650 CE.
Right.
And that basically the second part of the Talmud, which was the Gomorrah,
Right.
is the section that was written later. So
Right.
during the later time of the Gomorrah, wasn't Christianity more into being?
It didn't become the main religion of the Roman Empire till a little bit later. Now, it's true that the Talmud of the land of Israel, there was a period of time that Christianity became more of the religion. And it'd be interesting, I'm sure that there's a PhD doctrine. I'm sure there's a PhD dissertation, how the Talmud of the land of Israel, the Yerushalmi, might have a little bit more about Christianity than the Babylonian Talmud, because in Babylonia, Christianity didn't come to Babylonia at that time. So there may be, that's a good footnote, maybe there was a little bit more about Christianity, but it wasn't the main religion during most of the time. Certainly not in the time of the Mishnah. The Mishnah was completed around 200 CE. So Christianity was just a very, very minor religion at that time. And even in the land of Israel, it wasn't a major religion. So that's why I say that. Now, let me talk about some practical things that you can do today, if you really want to study the Talmud. There are good translations of the Talmud into English. And to get all of the big volumes of the Talmud, I don't know in how many volumes it would be, because I remember not all of the 63 tractates have Talmud, Gomorrah with them. The Mishnah, the actual English version of the Mishnah, can be one volume. I have the standard one right here, and it probably is a great place to begin. Or you can read the Pirkei Avot. But if you want to read the whole Talmud, there's a publication known as the Art Scroll Talmud, which has the text in English, and in Aramaic side by side. But it's a good translation with a lot of good footnotes. Most of the people who teach the
Rabbi?
Talmud, yes. Go ahead.
Yeah, with the translations, there's always been one part of the Talmud that I haven't been able to get, and that would be the Tosafot and Rashi's coming. Are there anywhere that's written in English?
The Tosafot and Rashi, those are the commentaries to the Talmud. And I would say that the Art Scroll translation doesn't have word for word the Tosafot and the Rashi, but it has many in the footnotes what those commentaries are. I don't want to get into the whole tradition of the printing of the Talmud, which goes back to Italy in the early days of the printing press, but they were included in the standard version of the Talmud as it was printed, with these commentators, which were medieval commentators from the 11th century. So I don't know any place where they're translated verbatim, word for word. But in the Art Scroll Talmud, there you have most of those commentators referenced in the footnotes. So yeah, but you have to remember that those are not really part of the Talmud. They're just commentaries on the Talmud, very important ones. But you want to study just the Talmud itself. But I can see your point, Joseph. The more you want, I would say the Art Scroll is your best place for that. All right?
Okay.
I don't know if you have a copy of it. And I mean, you start with one volume of it.
I've got all the Talmud, but I don't have, when I read you can't read the side things where it says the Tosafot and Rashi. And I always wonder what they're saying, because Rashi has some good stuff in the Torah and the Torah commentary.
Oh yeah. Well, Rashi was a great Torah commentator and a Talmud commentator. And again, I don't think that there are Torah translations that have all the Rashi in English. And matter of fact, on the internet.
The Art Scroll.
But the Art Scroll Talmud would have most of that. Now, here's what you do. You can sign up for study of what we call the Daf Yomi, the daily study of the Torah of the Talmud. Every day, a page of the Torah of the Talmud is studied over a period of 7 years, and during that 7 years, you go through the entire Talmud. DAF, Y Yomi, YOMI, Daf Yomi, and you can sign up free to study online the daily page of the Torah, and a lot of people do that, and it's a great thing. If you wanted to do it with a teacher, there's also opportunities. The one that I would recommend highly is my colleague, and we're getting to the end, is Rabbi Kornfeld, who does the study of the daily Talmud page locally, and just go to your island synagogue, maybe Mercer Island, but island synagogue, and you can study with him for an hour every day and study at least once in a while. If you have the Art Scroll, it's easier if you follow along, but you don't need it. And that would be an interesting thing. So I want to finish up. You've been so patient with me getting towards the end. You listened so carefully. I wish we had more time. But I want to give you one sentence, 4 words, that is the essence of the Talmud, which has the word Talmud in it. It's found in the prayer book. It's a quotation from the Mishnah, and it really explains what the basic value of the Talmud is. And it's this expression, Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam. Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam. Talmud means study. Torah means Jewish law or Jewish wisdom. Keneged is equaled Kulam, to all. Study of the Torah, Talmud Torah, is equal to all the other mitzvot of Judaism, even the ethical ones, according to them. According to the rabbis, studying the Torah is the most important and equal to all the other ones combined. And the answer is why. And the answer, the answer that I give, and what the rabbis say as well. Study of the Torah is imperative and of the highest value because it will lead you to the rest of living a good life. It's not for its own sake, although it can be. It's fun to study Torah, but the idea is that it will lead you to a good life. It will go to a good life, a righteous life, an ethical life, a meaningful life. Talmud Torah Keneged Kulam. All right, 2 minutes. Some of you were very quiet. I know you're listening carefully. So I'm going to have 2 minutes of question. Mort, 2 questions.
Yeah,
and then
in a later period, Maimonides wrote the Mishnah Torah. And I'm trying to get
yes.
Supplemental, or is it a reinterpretation? Or?
What Maimonides did in the 11th century, 12th century and the end of the 11th century was this. He wanted to say, I want to do a systematic explanation, a listing of the Jewish laws in a very organized way. And I'm going to do it in 14 categories based on an earlier writer, by the way. So his idea was just, I'm just going to give you the Jewish law. No stories in this particular book. No stories, no midrash, no sideline. This is just the law as it is. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Jewish law. So that's what Maimonides did. And a few other medieval people did the same, Alfasi and others. So the Mishnah Torah just means that the retelling of the Torah, but it really means Jewish law. So good question. All right, Melissa, go ahead.
So I would be curious to hear from people who do study the Talmud, and I know, Maya, Joe. So how do you make it relevant to your life today, particularly as a Reformed Jew?
I would say, yes, a really deep question. I'm going to give you a really short answer. I would say it's in a way, it's recreational in the best sense of the word. It's just something that's fun to do, enjoyable, and you don't have to look at it as something that's going to be that practical. It's just a fun thing to learn. It gives you an insight into Jewish history and Jewish law and Jewish values. But I wouldn't say it's going to be it's not a practical guide. That's not what the Talmud is today. It's not a practical guide for a Reformed Jew, or really for an Orthodox Jew either. It's something you do that will just lift you up spiritually, and just something fun to do. If you look at it as fun, that's the way to do it. All right, last one, Judith. Your last question. You didn't have a question. Judy? Judith doesn't have anybody. All right. You guys, last one, Donna. Go ahead.
Okay. My question is, if the purpose of basically being a Jew is to supposedly study the Torah, and that makes for a better Jewish life,
yeah.
How come in Israel they're not thought highly of the Orthodox, and they're not contributing if that's what the ultra-Orthodox do?
Well, here's the deal. I'll give you a very short answer. Every Jewish kid in Israel goes to school, and they do study the Torah, they do study the Talmud, they do study history. So their problem with the ultra-Orthodox Jews is not that they're studying the Talmud. That's not their problem. Their problem is that they're studying the Torah to the exclusion of other responsibilities that they should have in addition to that. In other words, they're saying, oh, studying Torah, Talmud is fine. And you could even go to, if you went to the army, and some ultra-Orthodox Jews do go to the army, you go to the army and you can have, you can have a Torah, a Talmud class in the army, and you can have a separate group of people studying together, but you're in the army and you're doing army kind of things most of the day, and you're studying part of the day. But at least for 3 years of your life, you should go into the army. That's what they're really saying. Not that you shouldn't study Talmud, but your responsibility is to go into the army like everybody else, because we're sending our kids, our sons and daughters, to the army, and some of them, sometimes it's dangerous. So you should have that same responsibility. So if that's not the problem, everybody's studying the Talmud to some extent, but you got to have the other things too. And then, as I say, another expression that I want to use is Torah im derech eretz. Torah, study, and practical life. Well, my friends, you have been so patient. Now, next week, I hope you come back, because Michael Banks is going to talk about history. And history is such an important part of our life, early history. But I'll be back in 2 weeks talking about God and ethics and other aspects of Jewish life, which I think is important. I didn't talk a lot about God. And I have to say, Talmud's not really that much focused on God, but implied is there. Have a great day. I'm waving goodbye. Have a beautiful day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Scott, for recording. And Baruch Hashem, take care. We'll see you soon. Thanks for helping me.
Thank you.
God bless
Thank
you
you.
all. Have a great day.